My name is Xan. This is my co-host Shoob. Thank you for tuning in today. We got another good video for today, as usual. Today we'll be discussing ACC win totals, and we'll be starting with the Atlantic Division. Shoob, would you like to explain to our audience or people who are maybe new to our channel how we do this system, how this is going to play out?
Yeah, so how this works is that Xan and I are each going to select over or under for each team's win total. As you can see here on this graphic, we'll be starting off here in this video with the ACC Atlantic Division. Xan will be in the X column. I will be in the S column. We're going to alternate back and forth for each team. And we're going to start off with the Clemson Tigers. Xan, what do you got with Clemson?
So there's a lot of things to like. There's a lot of things to like about the Clemson Tigers here. One thing that I particularly like about the Clemson Tigers is their crazy talented defense, especially their defensive line. They have Myles Murphy, Brian Breesy. Their defensive line is an absolute force. And I know that they just lost Brent Venables, and that is going to be a big question mark for this Clemson defense. But you cannot deny that Clemson far and away has the most talent on the defensive side of the ball. Clemson is absolutely stout defensively, and their second level linebackers led by Trenton Simpson, they are no joke as well. And not to mention, this Clemson in general has a history of good defenses here in the last 10 years. And I don't suspect that will change. I think here in the ACC, Clemson will have the best defense in the ACC, despite losing Venables. Now, with that being said, Clemson's loss of Venables may come at a cost. I know that Wes Goodwin has actually been at Clemson for a total of 11 years. And many of those years behind Venables as his right-hand man. There have been reports that he knows the defense pretty well, and they may not miss a beat, but at the same time, it is much different when you are the right-hand man or the assistant rather than being the guy making the play calls. So we could see Clemson take a little bit of a step back defensively, but from a talent perspective, they are absolutely the best and most talented team in the ACC. I don't see them deviating from that whatsoever. Another thing that really is interesting about Clemson, and I think this is kind of where their floor and ceiling is determined, is DJ Uiagalelei. Basically, he had a very, very rough year last season. And now it begs the question, is this Cade Klubnik time? So one thing that I kind of consider here is how loyal is Dabo Swinney to DJ Uiagalelei? Because if he considers himself loyal to DJ despite early season struggles, if that is to occur, then Clemson could see themselves drop a few games, not a few games, but maybe a game that would be costly to them as far as the playoff perspective is concerned before making the switch over to Klubnik. Now, I personally think that Klubnik will be the quarterback probably by the fourth or fifth week, but we'll see. One thing that Clemson really has going for them is that they have a very favorable early schedule. So DJ, they can get it figured out with DJ, or they can see if DJ is not the guy pretty early on. So that's a good benefit for Clemson, and that's something they really have going for them. Clemson also has 84% of its returning production on offense, which is outstanding. That is always something that you want to see returning from your offense. So there's still going to be I guess Clemson last year struggled a little bit offensively, but they can only improve from here with the returns. It's really just based on the quarterback. Again, the floor and the ceiling is entirely determined by who's going to play the quarterback position and how effective they're going to play the quarterback position. Their defense is going to be stout, maybe a step back, as I said. But ultimately, Clemson is still the best team in the ACC, in my personal opinion. And I don't see them deviating from their record of dominance. I do think they will have the best record in the ACC. But Shoob, one thing I really want to look at here, and just when I look at this holistically, I think Clemson, they're pegged at 10.5 here. So Clemson, I think, is a 10-win team. And because of the reasons that I mentioned, I can see them winning 11 as well. But I'm going to go with the under at 10, primarily because I don't know how long Dabo is going to keep up with DJ, especially if DJ is struggling. That could cost him a game in a crucial situation before they make the switch to Klubnik. I don't know how well the new defensive coordinator is going to play call. Even though the talent is there, will there be some growing pains with that? They could easily drop a game or two dependent on these things that are going on. However, they could not. That's why I could easily see them getting 11. But for the sake of these reasons and for the sake of the exercise, I think they're a 10-win team in the regular season. And for that reason, I'm going to take the undershoot.
Gotcha. So just a hair under. Xan predicting 10 wins for Clemson, most likely as the outcome. So that is just a hair under 10.5. And I also like your half-hearted attempt at pronouncing DJ's last name there. I'm just gonna say
Uyagale.
DJU. Yeah, Uiagalelei. I think that's more so. I think that's more correct. But anyways, I I'm not even gonna bother. I'm just gonna call him DJU. That's how I've
DJU.
always called him. But yes, you were right about Clemson. Like you mentioned, they have the 30th most returning production in FBS. The defense really carried them last year, and that's going to really be the theme with my verdict here on the win total is they had a top 5 defense. It was ranked number 4 overall in defensive efficiency in all of the country last year. And that's what really carried this team that really had some offensive struggles. And I mean, bad offensive struggles. DJU, I mean, it was very surprising to say the least to see him struggle so badly last year because Clemson fans have been spoiled by great quarterbacks over the last few seasons, Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, and then DJU is just supposed to be the next man up in that rotation. And he really struggled. And if you really look to see under the hood, his advanced metrics, he was really bad. He was one of the worst quarterbacks in all of Power Five. A Clemson quarterback was one of the worst QBs in all of Power Five. Now, of course, should we expect that to be the case again this year? Probably not. I mean, he has to be improved a little bit. Apparently, he was dealing with a little bit of an injury last year and he played through it all season. So that might have something to do with it. Cade Klubnik is going to be a guy that's waiting in the wings. And as you alluded to, he could get the nod mid-season. And I think that Cade Klubnik, I've heard a lot of great things about him. I think that at the end of the day, ultimately, I think if they go with him, I don't really think this is a hot take, but I think that Clemson ends up going to Cade at some point during the season, probably early on. And that I still think they can get to 11 wins. So I'm going to go with the over here. And part of my reasoning for this is that, yes, DJU was pretty awful last year, and this Clemson team still won 10 games last year. So Clemson had one of the worst quarterback performances in all of Power Five and still won 10 games. That just goes to show the talent of this Clemson team. This offense cannot be as bad as it was last year. You just have to think that it can only be better than it was last year. Of course, they have the change in coordinators. They have the new offensive coordinator who was promoted internally as well. Don't get me wrong, the coordinator is definitely a huge question mark, but I just look at Clemson's schedule and I think that it really played out favorably for them because last year they had to start out with Georgia to open their season with a brand new quarterback, and that didn't really go so well for them. They lost that game, but those first 3 games, like you mentioned, at Georgia Tech, Furman, Louisiana Tech, that's a pretty good ramp to kind of iron out and see what DJU is showing this year. And if he's not really showing up, it could be just enough time for them to maybe make the move to Cade Klubnik if that ends up being the case. And then they got to go at Wake and NC State, which are going to be 2 big games in this division. I also think that it also really benefits Clemson too, because one of their also tougher games is going to be at Notre Dame later in the season, but they have a bye week before they play Notre Dame on the road. So that's a huge advantage. I think that bye week plays into their favor as well. And if you look at 10.5 as the line, I'm going to go over. I think 11 wins is more likely than 10 wins. And again, I'm taking the over, and that still gives me room for Clemson to afford a loss, which they probably will lose maybe 1 game. And you can still hit this over. That's why I like it for Clemson.
Shoob, one thing I want to mention before we move on here is Will Shipley, their star running back last year, suffered a broken tibia in the NC State game. I'm really curious how he's going to come back from that, if he's going to be the same player, because he was a dominant player and at such a young age. People were comparing him to Christian McCaffrey, just being that kind of guy. So it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be nearly as effective after coming back from a major injury like that. So I'm interested in Clemson's offense, but I do think if Will Shipley is able to return to full strength, it definitely gives some more power for DJ to have some help.
Absolutely. Now moving on to NC State, the Wolfpack. They are a very interesting team going into the season. Their win total right now on Caesars is set at 8.5. And NC State returns the 8th most returning production in all of FBS. They went 9-3 last year. They almost won the Atlantic Division. They were in it all the way up until the very end. They, of course, beat Clemson last year in that thrilling overtime game at the beginning of the season. And NC State is a team that certainly will be on people's radars this year. They're not going to sneak up on anybody like they did last year. But I really like this NC State team, particularly because, of course, Devin Leary, he was pretty good last year. He was kind of quietly one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football. You look at his advanced numbers, he's very accurate. He can throw the deep ball very well. He can throw the deep ball accurately. He returns. As far as the receiving core, they do lose Amika Emezi, one of their best receivers last year, but they do return Devin Carter and Thayer Thomas at receiver, which is going to be a big help. Also, they do lose their top left tackle, Akeem Okwanu, who is going to be very hard to replace. He went in the top 10 of the NFL draft last year. So, of course, that's a huge piece to lose in the running game, especially. But I still think that NC State has the ability to make up for that and not drop off too much with those losses. And then defensively, they were number 12 last year in all of FBS and efficiency. It was a very good defense, and they returned 10 out of 11 starters this year. That is big. They should be a top 10 defense. I think that's a pretty safe bet to say that NC State will make that jump into the top 10 best defenses in all of college football in 2022. I think it's very impressive development what they've done there, and they have a lot of guys coming back, 10 out of 11 starters, as I just said. And then the schedule. I think the schedule also sort of is favorable, at least at the very beginning. They have all their 4 non-con games right at the start at East Carolina, Charleston Southern, Texas Tech, and UConn. All those games they should be favored in. And I think that it's a pretty good bet. NC State should expect to be 4-0 going into conference play. And then right at the jump, they got to play at Clemson in week 5, their 5th game. And that's going to be a make or break game. I think the winner of that game might possibly very well go on to win this division. NC State got them last year in Raleigh, but this year it's going to be at Clemson. So that's certainly going to be tough. But even if NC State does lose that game, I still think the floor is very high for this team. And if you look at the rest of the schedule, they got Wake Forest at home. They got Boston College, Florida State at home. The end is going to be a little bit tricky. They got to go at Louisville and at North Carolina back to back. But I think that NC State has a really good chance to be a good team this year. I think 8.5 is a little bit low. I think the floor is 8 wins for this team. The defense is going to be really good. It's going to carry them. And then you have a really good quarterback with Devin Leary. As long as he stays healthy all year, I think this NC State team has the upside to get double-digit wins. They have the upside to win the ACC. If Clemson has another down year, that Clemson doesn't figure it out offensively, NC State can take this thing and they can be what Pitt was last year. And the one thing about NC State I will say is that I would just wish that their head coach, Dave Doeren, he's a very good head coach, but he is so conservative with his 4th down decision making. If you look at advanced numbers, he really cost NC State so many opportunities by not going for it in a lot of 4th and short situations. And that's one thing that I absolutely hate, especially when it's a team like this where you had all these guys, all these seniors, they all came back this year to win the ACC. NC State's really putting all their chips in this year. If Dave Doeren can be a little bit more aggressive on some 4th down situations instead of punting the ball, I think this NC State team can not shoot itself in the foot and accomplish a little bit more than what it did last year. So that is why I'm going to go over. And it's one of the better plays that I feel about in this entire ACC conference. I think NC State has a very good shot to win 9 or 10 games, a way better shot than to lose or to win 8 games or less.
I agree with most of what, actually, I agreed with everything that you said, Shoob. There are a lot of things that I love about this NC State team. Everything that you said is a part of that. Another few things about NC State in particular, you mentioned that week 5 matchup with Clemson and how we mentioned DJU and how he may potentially be the starter for that game. What if he's struggling and what if Dabo is staying loyal to DJ? This could spell NC State win. This is one of those games where I can't write it off for Clemson. I think NC State could very well take this game from Clemson, especially if DJU is the quarterback. Or perhaps Cade Klubnik has taken over at this point in time, but he's showing a little bit of some freshman struggles. You never know with these kind of things, in addition to their defensive issues with Clemson, is going back to them. So NC State, I think, is definitely in play to beat Clemson in week 5. Not to mention it's early season. It's the perfect time for NC State to play Clemson. If it were a later season game, I would lean more towards Clemson. I'm already leaning Clemson a little bit, but NC State has a significantly increased chance of winning that game because it's early season, I think, which will help them in the long run to not only winning their conference, to potentially getting into the college football playoff. Now, that is an NC State fan's dream. I don't think it's going to happen, but I would love to see one of those programs like NC State shake it up a little bit, you know? One thing I really want to point out between NC State and Clemson is in the last 5 years in the Textile Bowl, Clemson is 4-1 against NC State. But in three of those matchups, NC State either won or lost by a touchdown. One of those games being in overtime. NC State has been there. NC State has been able to contest Clemson. NC State knows how to play Clemson. They've proven that time and time again, even though two of those last 5 years they were absolutely blown out. But when you have a team like Clemson who recruits at such a premium level relative to you, and you're able to play them close like that, if not beat them, 3 times out of 5, I think if you're an NC State fan, you'll take that. That is pretty good. And I think their head coach, Doran, deserves quite a bit of praise for that. And honestly, that's massively impressive. Hats off to NC State. Hats off to your fan base. That's fantastic. I'm absolutely excited for you guys. One thing about the offense I want to mention, we were talking about lost production. They do have all this returning production, but the one main person that's leaving is their star running back, Xan Shoob. He went to the NFL. He's no longer with the team. And so we'll see someone else fill in over here at the running back position for NC State. But with their quarterback and a lot of their receivers that they have coming back, they have so much returning production. NC State is just one of those teams that I think is primed for such a good year. And if it's not this year, I don't know when it would be for NC State. NC State, this is such an important year for you. If you are able to have a successful year here, if you are able to win your conference and potentially get into the college football playoff, you can capitalize in recruiting. You can capitalize on so many other things, especially with what's going on nowadays. And this would be so pivotal for your program. And that is one thing that I want to see. I want to see more middle tier programs like this who are just on the fringe of making that next leap get that chance to play for something. And so for me, if I'm an NC State fan, I am really looking forward to this season. And with that being said, I have NC State pegged for 8 to maybe 9 wins, but I'm taking the over on NC State. I really like this team a lot. I just believe in everything that they're doing right now. I think that this is one of the best teams that the school has had in a very, very long time. And if they are ever going to win it, it's going to be this year as far as the ACC and making the college football playoff is concerned. When you look at their schedule over here, I think Charleston Southern, UConn, Syracuse, Boston College, those are 4 games that I think are in the bag for them. Clemson could be a bad game for them. And then again, their other games are possibles, but I think they'll win most of those, 4 to 5 of them. So I'm liking them for at least 9 wins. I think they can win up to 10 or 11, but I think their floor is 7 if everything just absolutely does not go the way things are planned out. But with that being said, this is a good team. If your floor is 7, that is a good team. And that is if everything goes wrong for you. So NC State fans, be happy because this is going to be a good season for you.
Absolutely. And even if they lose to Clemson in early in the season, that week 5 game doesn't mean the season's over. NC State can still accomplish a lot. You can get to a New Year's Six bowl. I think that's a lot to be celebrated. And the one thing that I think maybe is going against NC State this year as opposed to last year is that they're not going to sneak up on Clemson like they did last year. And even though a lot of these guys came back, a lot of these seniors, they came back because they knew that they could put together a team with a ton of experience that has the ability to win the ACC. So we'll see if they can get it done. I do kind of wish that the ACC had changed their scheduling format starting this year and got rid of the division format, because if NC State was in the ACC Coastal, if NC State was over in the Coastal, I think they'd be the favorite to win that division. Now moving down here to a team that did accomplish a lot last season as well. In fact, they won the ACC Atlantic division last year. The Wake Forest Demon Deacons. The Deeks came out of nowhere last year, won this division. What's your take on them?
I really like the Demon Deacons this year. You know, they are, a lot of people say they were lightning in a bottle, one time kind of just magical season for the Demon Deacons. I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think the Demon Deacons are up for a good season. There's a lot of things to like about this team. First off, I'd like to give a shout out to their head coach, Dave Clawson. He's done a great job with this team and building this team into something that the Wake faithful can be proud of and that they can be excited for. Generally speaking, a Wake Forest football fan does not have a lot to be excited for, at least not to this level, because there is some hype. There's some very real hype behind Wake Forest and their potential in the ACC and to compete in the ACC. Now, when we look at Wake Forest, of course, the crown jewel is quarterback Sam Hartman. He's absolutely incredible. Still a young guy. Threw for over 4,000 yards last season, had 39 touchdowns, only 14 picks. He can only get better from here. In addition to that, Shoob, and one thing I absolutely love in regards to Wake Forest and the Demon Deacons is they are returning so much production at the wide receiver position, so much. A.T. Perry is the best player that they're returning. He had 1,300 yards, 15 touchdowns. He was averaging 18 yards per catch, Shoob. 18 yards per catch. This dude's an absolute playmaker, and he will be playing on Sundays. There are just so many guys that they have. They also have Donovan Green, who was he's a young guy. He's got, I think, 3 or 4 years of eligibility left. He had 500 plus yards. Taylor Morin. And when you combine all those guys, they have over 2,500 yards of production returning just in receiving. And then you've got a quarterback who can sling the ball. Another thing that is super impressive about this team, Shoob, is Wake Forest last year had one of the worst offensive lines in all of FBS. One of the worst offensive lines in all of FBS. And Hartman was still able to put up those crazy numbers. And he's a young guy. This is no scrub. If you can have a bad offensive line, what do we often hear as the primary excuse for why a quarterback is not panning out? Usually it's the offensive line, right? Coaching staff, offensive line, sure. But the offensive line is the primary thing. It's the glue that holds the offense together. And people don't give it enough credit. In this case, Wake Forest has not really protected their quarterback very well, and yet they're still getting great results from it. So, Shoob, the biggest thing about Wake Forest is their defense, the absolute Achilles heel of that team. They were ranked 91st last year in defensive yards allowed. They allowed over 413 yards per game, which is just not going to get the job done. They did get some transfers in this class to help bolster their defensive line in Rice transfer Kobe Turner, who will help the defensive line bolster their and hopefully improve their team. But ultimately, I don't think that's going to be enough to ultimately improve the whole unit together. If they improve even just modestly, Shoob, this team can be so great. That's one thing about Wake Forest, and I really like them this year for that reason. Another thing about Wake Forest that I was originally bullish on, was that they lost Christian Beal-Smith to transfer to South Carolina, their star running back. But then it dawned on me, Wake Forest has another really talented young running back by the name of Justice Ellison, who ran for 541 yards last year, and he averaged 5.1 yards per carry. He's going to be around for a while, so Wake Forest is not missing a beat. The only thing that they can do is try to bolster that offensive line. And if they're able to protect Hartman just a little bit better and able to improve modestly on defense, then I don't see what's going to hold the Demon Deacons back. And for that reason, I'm taking the over on the Demon Deacons.
Nice. So you got the over for the Deeks. So like you mentioned with Sam Hartman returning, of course, on offense, of course, there's a lot to like with this Demon Deek squad offensively. They did put up really good numbers last year. They do have their better receivers returning with AJ Perry, Donovan Green, as you mentioned. He returns from injury as well at the receiving position. So, of course, the quarterback and the skill positions you assume are going to put up good numbers. But one thing that if you deep dive a little bit into Sam Hartman, a lot of the advanced numbers suggest he's maybe not quite as good as he actually looked. I think that a lot of his numbers were maybe inflated last year. And with the offensive line, it might be hard for him to just repeat what he was able to do last year in terms of sheer numbers. I'm not saying he's going to drop off tremendously, but it might be hard for him to just match exactly what he was able to do last year, even though he's coming back and he's got a few of his better receivers returning as well. But that being said, the offense is still going to be pretty good. But as you alluded to, it's the defense, man. The defense was not that great last year. It was rather average. And they do bring in a new defensive coordinator, but they only returned 50% of that production off of last year's defense. So it's very hard to envision the defense getting better, that much better, if not at all. And I think that's going to be the Achilles heel again for this Wake Forest team, unfortunately, it's going to be a lot harder for them to potentially win the ACC as well, with expecting NC State and Clemson to be better than they were last year as well. As far as their schedule, their non-con is pretty winnable. They got the Virginia Military Institute at home to open up the season. Congrats on your win. Then they got to go at Vanderbilt in week 2. Congrats on your win. Then they got Liberty at home. Might be a little bit tough, but I feel like they should win that game. And then you ramp right into Clemson at home. Bam, week 4. That's going to be another make or break game. This ACC Atlantic division, Clemson, Wake, NC State, they all play each other right at the beginning of the season. So We're going to see how that shakes out. Then they got to go at FSU. And then later on in the season, they have a stretch where they got Boston College at home. Then they go at Louisville, at NC State, and then North Carolina. I feel like you might expect to see a loss or two in that stretch as well. And the line here is sitting at 8.5. I just think that 8 to 9 wins sounds about right for this Wake Forest team. And the line's sitting there at 8.5. So I'm going to choose under, even though I'm not very confident about it. Like I said, it's a very it's a very small lean for me. I think 8 or 9 wins is probably about right. I'm going to say maybe 8 wins. I don't think that they can exactly do what they were able to do last year, but I still think they'll be pretty solid. So that's what I got for Wake Forest.
So now let's shift our attention over to Florida State. Very interesting team to talk about. A lot going on with this program. Shoob, why don't you fill us in with what you think about Florida State?
So for Florida State, they are a very interesting team. Their line's sitting at 7 games right now, 7 even. And this actually came down. It opened up at 7.5. And apparently a lot of sharp betting money has come on the under here. So it's gone down to 7. Florida State had a little bit of a disappointing 5-7 year last year. They didn't make a bowl game. However, they do return 17th, the most production in FBS, the 17th most amount. Head coach Mike Norvell went out and he got a lot of transfers. He went ham in the transfer portal. So this Florida State team certainly should be interesting. A lot of new faces coming on this year. As far as the offense, I think it goes without saying that quarterback Jordan Travis returns, and his ability to run the ball is key for this offense. 2 of their quarterbacks behind him, however, are young and unproven, and Tate Rodemaker and AJ Duffy. So I think that a lot of the flack for Florida State last year was that they didn't really have that great of an offensive line, and Jordan Travis ran the ball so much, and that he really opened himself for the risk of injury. And the question of, does quarterback play come into the factor here for Florida State in this win total? And if you actually looked at it, their offensive line was actually average in line yards. They weren't great by any means, but they weren't terrible like the narrative was about them. So I would expect the offensive line to at least be a little bit improved from where it was last year. And maybe the threat of Jordan Travis getting hurt maybe isn't as bad as we may all think. However, it is definitely a concern, the quarterback depth behind him, but we shall see. As far as the new offensive coordinator, their former left, and he went to go to Oregon. So their new offensive coordinator is actually the offensive line coach from last year. He got promoted internally. I don't know if that's really going to make a difference at all for the performance of the O-line, but we shall see. As far as the defense was pretty average last year as well. They do return 7 starters, and they bring in transfer edge rusher Jared Verse from Albany, of all places. He's going to sort of come in and fill the role of Jermaine Johnson, who they lost to the draft last year. He was a very good player they got from Georgia in the portal. So we'll see if Jared Verse from Albany comes in, and maybe at least if he can match 80% of what Jermaine Johnson was able to do at that edge position, that'll be good for Florida State defensively. As far as their schedule, though, I think this is the biggest pitfall with this Florida State team is you look at their schedule. Their win total is sitting at 7 games. The odds makers think they should be good enough to get to a bowl game this year. Of course, first game they open up is against Duquesne at home. Congrats on your win. But then they got to go to New Orleans to face LSU, which is basically a road game. That stadium's going to be packed with LSU fans. Right there in week 1, actually, they have a week 0 game. And then week 1 versus LSU, their second game of the season, we're really going to find out what this Florida State team is made of. So that'll be very interesting. But then the other thing about this schedule is if you look at it, of course, LSU and NOLA week 2 is huge, but then they got to go at Louisville, at NC State, at Miami. That's a very tough stretch. And those are all the teams that you consider are roughly on par with Florida State, or teams that you would think Florida State needs to jump in order to climb their way up these ACC standings. They got to play all those teams I just mentioned on the road. And then that's also not to mention that they got to play Florida at the end of the year at home. We don't know what quite to expect with that Florida team, but that should be a tough game. They also got to play Louisiana as well, which isn't just a big pushover as a G5 team there towards the end of the year. They do have Clemson and Wake Forest at home. I think they might have a good chance to maybe beat a Wake Forest team, but Clemson, we shall see. I expect Clemson to be a little bit better, but you're just looking at the schedule here. I just went through it all. I think 8 wins is going to be pretty tough. 8 wins is going to be tough for this Florida State team to accomplish, in my opinion. They could still have a fairly good year, but with that schedule, I think even 7 wins, just meeting this line and pushing, that's going to be a little bit challenging. So, with all that being said, I'm going to take the under here for Florida State. I do think it's pretty possible, pretty likely they can get to 6 wins and go to a bowl game. But when the line's sitting there at 7 games, I got to lean towards the under. If it was up at 7.5, like it was earlier a few months ago, I would definitely hammer this under. But I'm going to safely say a little bit of a lean here towards the under for FSU.
Well said, Shub. I agree with a lot of those points that you just brought up. Another thing that I really want to bring up about this team is they actually brought in a couple of offensive linemen to help bolster their offensive line in the portal. So that's going to be another thing that's going to help them out, hopefully, because Jordan Travis was running for his life constantly. And despite him running for his life constantly, he was very good at minimizing his turnovers. He had 15 touchdowns to 6 interceptions. And if the offensive line play just improves a little bit and allows him to use his mobility more so to escape rushers rather than to rush every other play, then I think there is a significant leap to be made for Jordan Travis. They also got a good transfer running back from Oregon. His name's Trey Benson. He didn't get a lot of production over there at Oregon, but FSU fans believe that he can be the next productive running back over there at FSU. So they're really hoping, they have high hopes for him, and he's projected to be the starter. So that's another guy that we can look at as we dive into this FSU team. Another guy FSU fans have been talking about is AJ Duffy, their recent freshman quarterback who's coming in. Highly talented. I don't suspect you're going to see AJ Duffy this year, but he's someone that we're going to watch moving forward. And he's someone that, could be the future of Nole football. We'll see, but not this year. And like you said, Shub, I mean, their schedule is a little iffy. I think they'll win against Duquesne. I think they'll win against G-Tech. I think they'll beat Cuse. And I think they'll beat Louisiana without Napier. And not to mention Louisiana got absolutely gutted in the transfer portal after Napier left. I think LSU is a loss. I think Clemson's a loss. But in those other games left on their schedule, I think they can go roughly 3-3 in that, which puts them at 7 wins. And if they're at 7 wins, the line's sitting there at 7. If I'm going to bet my money, I'm not going to bet to push. So for that premise alone, I'm going to take the under. I do believe that Florida State is a 7-win team this year, if push comes to shove. But again, for the sake of this exercise, and if I am betting my money, I'm taking the under because this is push insurance in the opposite direction for me. And so with that being said, I think Florida State, their win ceiling, if all goes right for them and they make significant improvement this year, is 9 wins. But if things go tremendously wrong for them, I think their floor is 5. So there's a lot of leeway with Florida State this year, but I do like them for 7 wins.
I think if Florida State was to get to 9 wins, I think FSU fans would have to be pretty happy about that, considering where their program was just a year or two ago and the uphill battle that the rebuilding project has been for Mike Norvell there in Tallahassee. Now moving on to Boston College. Boston College, their win total sitting at 6 even. What's your take on these guys?
There's a lot of things to like about Boston College. They're not one of those teams that gets talked about much in media or just at all. You hear about them, playing teams close from time to time, especially Clemson every now and then. But one thing I really like about Boston College is Phil Jurkovec. He's a very talented quarterback who they have. He's returning from injury after being lost for last season. We also have wide receiver Zay Flowers, who's a really good extremely good wide receiver. He's projected to go anywhere from the 1st to 3rd round. One thing about Zay Flowers is we actually made a video about Zay Flowers. So if you watch us on YouTube, check out that video if you get a chance. He's a very unique case, but he's another guy who's actually a baller and someone to watch out for in that offense. They also return a 1,000-yard rusher in Pat Garwo, another young guy averaging 5 yards a carry. They do have a decent amount of offensive production there. He's 5'8", 214. That dude's a muscle hamster. So there's kind of like your prototypical Boston College running back, as we kind of notice what they like. Another person that I really want to bring up about Boston College is a 4-star transfer from Notre Dame, tight end George Takex. He's 6'7". He didn't get to play much at Notre Dame, but this man is a 6'7", former 4-star, and he will look to spread the field and create mismatches for Boston College. I think it'll help them improve their offense with Phil Jurkovec coming back as well. I think they can only improve from here. Another thing that I really like about Boston College actually is that they had the 28th ranked defense last season in terms of yards allowed, which is very sneaky. You wouldn't expect that from Boston College, but that's the thing. No one really pays attention to Boston College. And so when you take a look at the metrics and the stats, it's a very good, it's a very interesting stat to see. Now, they were 103rd in offensive production last year, but that is primarily losing Jurkovic. They were not able to cope with that very well, but I think Boston College is at least looking for a chance to have a decent season with him back. When you analyze their schedule, Shoob, I think they'll beat Rutgers. I think they'll beat Maine. I think they'll beat Duke. I think they'll beat UConn. That's four in the bag I think they've got. I don't think they beat Clemson, although they've played Clemson close in the past. I think they could play Clemson close. I think the potential's there, especially with the uncertainty at Clemson with certain positions and the new coordinator that we just discussed in our Clemson section of this. But as far as everything else and the possibles on there, oh, I don't think they beat Notre Dame either, by the way. But everything else is a possible on their schedule. But out of all of that, I think they go about 2-4 in that group. 4-2 max if things really go their way, but I think 2-4 is kind of where I'm going to peg them. And so if we do the math there, that's going to put us at about 6 wins for my projection for Boston College. But I think their absolute ceiling is 8, but that is only if everything absolutely goes their way. I am projecting Boston College for 6 wins. And with 6 being the line for Boston College, I have to take the undershoe because, again, if I'm going to bet my money, I am not betting to go even. I'm not betting to get my money back. I'm betting because I think I am going to win. So if anything, it's push insurance in the opposite direction one more time. So I'm going to take Boston College on the under, even though I do like them and I think they have a lot of talent. I just don't see them beating that this season.
This is Jeff Hafley's third season at the helm up there in Boston. And it was really interesting to see what happened to Boston College last year. They went 6-6. They did manage to get to a bowl game despite Jurkovic's injury, but they went 2-6 in ACC play, which is very interesting. So they did struggle in conference, even though they went 4-0 in non-con play. Don't think it'll be quite that easy this year, of course, with that at Notre Dame on the docket for this year in the non-con. But last year, of course, the offense was pretty poor, and that goes without saying. It's because Jurkovic missed a huge chunk of last season. And their leading receiver, Zay Flowers, of course, go check out that video about him. He's a great player. I think that connection of Jurkovic and Flowers would be a huge deal for this offense. However, the offensive line, that's the biggest problem here. And that's one of the biggest pitfalls with, I think that's going to happen to this Boston College team is that they lose 4 starters from the offensive line from last year. And that offensive line last year already really wasn't that good. And if you look at the lack of QB depth behind Jurkovic on this roster, you know, if Jurkovic is susceptible to injury and the offensive line will probably be worse than it was last year, that worries me. If there's another Jurkovic injury, I think this under is certainly going to hit. But I think the best case for Boston College, of course, is Jurkovic stays healthy all season long and the offensive line play can at least hold up to be at least somewhat on par with what it was last year, even though it really wasn't that good. So that's a big question mark for me. I think ultimately the offensive line is going to be the biggest problem for this offense to get going, which kind of sucks because I really do like Phil Jurkovic. And I think that him and Devin Leary, I was surprised both those guys didn't go into the draft last year with a weak quarterback class, but we shall see how it goes. It'll certainly be interesting for this division. A lot of good quarterbacks in this division. And then on the defense, they do return 7 out of 11 starters. They could be a little bit more improved than they were last year, but you know, Boston College, they're projected by the odds makers as a 6-win team. That non-con, Rutgers at home. We're not very high on this Rutgers team, you and I. They got Maine. That should be a win. At UConn should be a win. And then at Notre Dame. I think if you're Boston College, you should probably realistically expect to be 3-1 in that stretch. And then also you do draw Duke and Syracuse at home. I think it was good that Boston College drew Duke in the crossover, which I think is a pretty safe to say should be a free win this year. So that makes about 5 wins, I suspect, for Boston College. And that's the problem. You're looking at the line here at 6. It's hard for me to find 2 more wins with the rest of the schedule here. Boston College, they got to go at Virginia Tech. A lot of these toss-up games at Virginia Tech, at FSU, at Wake Forest, at NC State. You know, it might be tough sledding for this Boston College team to get north of 6 wins. I think 6 is about right, but if I had to take a lean, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to go under as well for BC. So now moving down here to Louisville. Louisville is white hot, not red hot. They are white hot on the recruiting trail. Louisville getting a lot of momentum on that front. But as far as the on-field team this year, Scott Satterfield, he's returning, and he's a head coach that, despite the hot recruiting they got going on right now, this guy's on the hot seat. So it'll be very interesting to see. Louisville is going to be a very interesting team coming up this year to pay attention to. And I think there's a lot of good things that they got going at Louisville. And for Scott Satterfield's case to remain the coach at Louisville, they do return the 12th most returning production in all of FBS. Satterfield went ham in the transfer portal. They have a lot of turnover going in and out in the transfer portal. Malik Cunningham, their quarterback, he returns. He is absolutely vital to this offense. Malik Cunningham, a very good player. When we did our podcast back in 2020, we were very high on him, and we think that he's a guy that, if everything goes absolutely perfectly right for Louisville this year and Cunningham shines, he's a guy that could be on a Heisman watch list by the end of the year. And that's best case scenario for Louisville. But more realistically, we think he's a very good quarterback. At least I do. And I think that Louisville, I think the biggest question for the offense is that there's a lot of turnover at wide receiver. They lost a lot of guys, but they also bring in a lot of guys in the portal. So it's kind of hard to tell whether or not it's going to be a loss, a gain. We don't know what's going to happen. That's going to be a big question mark on the receiving front for Louisville. And they have a new offensive coordinator, Lance Taylor, who was the running back coach at Notre Dame prior to his new stint at Louisville. So the new offensive coordinator, we shall see how it goes there. As far as the defense, their best player, I got to mention his name, Yasir Abdullah. He was one of the best defensive players on this Louisville team. He returns. That's a huge, huge plus for this Louisville defense. And if you look at their schedule, it is kind of tough. They do schedule aggressively in the non-con. They got to go at UCF, which honestly is probably a little bit of a toss-up game, but certainly one that Louisville can win. They got to go to the bounce house, however. Then they got USF at home. James Madison at home, who's making the move up to FBS this year. And then, of course, they got to go at Kentucky this year, which will be certainly tough. And then in the crossover, they draw Pitt at home, and then they got to go at Virginia. So if you look at this schedule, I mean, this is the thing with Louisville. It was very hard for me to come to a verdict on this team. And I already have so many unders in this division. I have unders on Wake, Florida State, Boston College. And I originally was leaning under for Louisville, but somebody's got to win games. That's the thing. When you're doing all these teams in one division, somebody's going to have to win these games. I can't keep saying under. Somebody's going to have to win games, and I'm going to say Louisville. I think they can get to 6 wins. It seems about right. I think there's upside for more, of course, with Malik Cunningham and company. If everything goes right for them, this is a team that could get to 7, 8, maybe even 9 wins if everything just goes right. It is a tough division. They're going to have to win those 50-50 games, but I'm going to play the upside here. I'm going to say over for Louisville and Scott Satterfield, who, if they get over here on this win total, he's going to keep his job.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, Shoob. I'm definitely I'm definitely in agreement with Malik Cunningham. The dude's an absolute beast. Just to kind of put it into perspective for Malik Cunningham, he had 2,900 passing yards last year, 19 touchdowns thrown, 6 picks. But the thing that really sticks out about Malik Cunningham, Shoob, the thing that's absolutely crazy and why he could be a Heisman finalist is he had over 1,000 rushing yards in addition to that. And get this, 20 rushing touchdowns. That is insane. Malik Cunningham is basically their entire offense. It's absolutely insane. They had the number 21 rated offense last season, and this is entirely because of Malik Cunningham. The team lives and dies by Malik Cunningham. It's absolutely crazy. One thing that I'm a little bullish on with this team is their defense, Shoob. They were 84th last season in defensive yardage, and essentially They might get a little bit better. They did get a couple of DBs in the transfer portal who are expected to play a significant role there. There's the FSU transfer, Jarvis Brownlee, and the transfer from Middle Tennessee State, Quincy Riley, both projected to be playing heavily in rotation, and both are pretty good players. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of turnover at the wide receiver position, like in and out, in and out. They lost one of their top guys to Alabama in the transfer portal. His name was Tyler Harrell. But not all is lost. They actually were able to replace him with a Central Arkansas transfer. His name's Tyler Hudson. Highly touted guy. He had 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns last year for Central Arkansas. He's considered a pretty talented guy who can fill that gap. So I think they're going to kind of they lose some, but they also bring some in. I don't think it's going to make too much of a difference at the wide receiver position. And as you mentioned with the schedule, Shoob, for me, I like Cuse, I like USF and James Madison for wins, although I don't think James Madison is a free win just because it's actually still a pretty good program, even though they're just now kind of slowly moving towards FBS. I don't think they're going to beat Clemson, but I am in the minority here, and I will go on record saying that I do think Louisville can beat Kentucky this year. I said that in our original SEC East predictions, that I think it's more of a toss-up game for Kentucky and Louisville than a lot of people think. I think it is possible, dependent on how their defense improves, that they could contest NC State, given that Malik Cunningham stays healthy. Wake Forest, given their atrocious defense, Malik Cunningham is going to feast. The Wake Forest Louisville game is one that I really want to watch too, because the final score of that one is going to be like 55-52. It's just going to be a light show. It's going to be a light show. It's going to be fireworks. It's going to be the 4th of July. That's going to be a good game to watch. And then, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty with Pitt, with everything that they've lost. That's a possible win for them as well. Maybe Virginia. Virginia's a good team. Possibly FSU, UCF. They're winnable games. But ultimately, I think I'm going to peg this team at about 7 wins. And I like that for the over because their line is 6. And if anything, I actually feel very comfortable taking Louisville on the over. If I were to make a bet comfortably in this entire group, it would be Louisville. I do not suspect Louisville will be under 6 wins. I would be absolutely flabbergasted if they were under 6 wins. At the very minimum, it will be 6 wins, and that's worst case scenario. The only thing that would put Louisville under is an injury to Malik Cunningham. If that happens, Louisville they're done. So if you are betting, you're betting that also that Malik Cunningham's going to stay healthy. So given those circumstances, if you think Malik Cunningham can stay healthy, I think it is easy money to take the over, or if not, get your push back on the push insurance with your money for Louisville. And for me, that's safe. I actually think Louisville has the potential to win up to 9 games this year. I'm higher on them than most people are, but that's why I have them on the over, baby. And I really like Louisville this year, and I think they're a sleeper team in that division.
I like it. I like it. And Xan's calling it right now. Louisville's going into Lexington final week of the season beating Kentucky, or at least you think it's more likely than what most people think.
Yeah, I think if they lose that game, it's going to be a close one as long as Cunningham's there. And then not to mention Kentucky just lost Rodriguez, so they're going to lose some offensive production as well. It's going to be a battle. And I think it's going to be a good one too.
I was just about to say, if you think about all the teams in college football whose quarterbacks pose the most threat to their derailing their team's win totals with injuries, I think you have Arkansas with KJ Jefferson, and then of course Louisville, Malik Cunningham is right up there. And of course, I'm going against my logic on Arkansas by taking the over here, but I'm with you. I think there's more than just Malik Cunningham with this team. And of course, you're taking a risk that Malik Cunningham doesn't get hurt by taking this over. So now moving down to the bottom here to Syracuse. Syracuse, the Orange, sitting at 4 wins right now, their win total. What do you got for Syracuse?
So Syracuse is actually a better team than most people give them credit for. Nobody watches Syracuse outside of the Syracuse faithful or whoever's playing Syracuse that week. Nobody. And so no one actually knows that Syracuse is actually a pretty decent team. They have Sean Tucker. Of course, that's the one guy that everybody knows. He rushed for 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns. He averaged 6 yards a carry. He's an absolute beast. He's going to go to the NFL. He's going to be a 1st or 2nd round pick. He's a stud. No doubt about that. They also brought in a transfer from New Mexico State. He had 700 yards and 10 touchdowns, and that's going to help take some of the pressure off of Sean Tucker, which is someone who has become their workhorse. And of course, you don't want that man to get injured because he's essentially become their entire offense. And Another thing that I really want to mention about this team, Shub, is I think their defensive coordinator, Tony White, has done a phenomenal job with this team. And given the talent that's on this roster, like working with what he has, I think that man deserves a raise. Because when you look at the metrics here, they were actually 19th in defense last year in yards allowed. And they brought in some transfers who I think are going to help them as well. They brought in transfer Elijah Clark from Rutgers. Whoa, I know, right? Rutgers. You think a Rutgers guy is going to help? Oh my God. This guy was actually one of like the very few bright spots in the Rutgers defense last year. And he's going to be a spark for this team on the defensive side. I think it'll help improve their defensive woes. Well, not necessarily their woes, but I think it'll help them improve their defense because their defense is already pretty stout. And they got a transfer from Dartmouth. You would never guess, right? But highly touted Isaiah Johnson, and he is coming from Dartmouth, and he's another guy that they're very excited about. And I think this defense is going to at least stay as good as they were last year. They brought in all those guys, and another guy that I'd like to bring a little bit of attention to on the offensive side of the ball, who didn't have a lot of yards produced last year, but I think has some potential to have a potential breakout year, is Courtney Jackson. That's a name to look out for. I think that's going to be a wide receiver who could potentially blow up this year for this team if the quarterback situation gets fixed. And that's where I'm kind of jumping into here, Shub. Their quarterback for last year was a Mississippi State transfer by the name of Garrett Schrader. And when I initially looked through and I was studying this team, I was thinking, man, this Schrader guy, his stats aren't that bad. He must have played just a few games. Wrong. So he had 9 touchdowns, 4 interceptions, 1,450 yards. And for me, I thought, okay, maybe he just played 2 or 3 games. No, this man played all but 2 games. So yes, he doesn't turn the ball over, but he's incredibly inefficient at running that position, and just shows you how much that Syracuse hands the ball off because they have so much faith in Sean Tucker, and why they brought in the New Mexico State transfer to kind of take the load off of Sean Tucker, because if he gets hurt, all hope is lost. The offense is done. And so Syracuse has a very reputable defense. Surprising. That shocked me when I found that out. And they also have a strong running attack. Really, their weakness is that they had the 94th rated offense last year, and that's because they didn't have a lot of production in the passing game. And ultimately, when you look at their schedule, I think they beat UConn. I think they beat Wagner. They're probably going to lose to Clemson, Notre Dame, Wake Forest, NC State, Louisville, Purdue. Like I'm kind of hashing those up as losses, but they could potentially beat Boston College, Pitt, FSU. Just depends on how those teams look. But I'm thinking they only win maximum one of those games. So with that being said, I'm thinking about 3 wins is where I'm going to peg Syracuse, despite all these things that I like about them that most people don't know about. And so with 3 wins, that would be the under, Shoob. So I'm taking Syracuse on the under.
All that hype about Syracuse and you go under on them. Man, that's brutal. No, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think Syracuse, like you said, it's a team that nobody really pays attention to. And there's a lot of these ACC teams, especially. There's so much that when you really like deep dive in your research about this conference, there's so much going on, so many coaches on the hot seat, so many interesting teams, so many good quarterbacks as well. This ACC conference really, if you really pay attention to the middle tier and bottom tier of it, it's going to be very interesting this year for these teams. And Syracuse, that is certainly the case. Dino Babers, the head coach, he has a lot of pressure on him this season. I'm not sure that he's quite on the hot seat, but I've heard rumblings that his time there may be coming to a close if they have another really bad season. But we shall see. He has not been to a bowl game so far in 5 out of 6 seasons, rather. So at Syracuse, the goal is to get to bowl games. He hasn't been able to do that in a majority of his time there. And the thing that really stood out about Syracuse is, of course, they returned the 9th most returning production in all of FBS, which, of course, is a good thing. But they're one of the youngest teams in FBS. Only 2 of their projected starters are seniors. Only 2. If you look at this roster, it's a ton of true sophomores, true juniors, even some redshirt freshmen thrown in there. It is such a young team. And I think that the Syracuse team is maybe a little bit better than what people give them credit for, as you alluded to. Garrett Schrader returns a quarterback. He wasn't that great last year, but I think the thing with Garrett Schrader is that they brought in a new offensive coordinator. Dino Babers went out and got Virginia's offensive coordinator, Robert Anaya. And I think that was low key kind of a good hire because Virginia had a pretty good offense last year, of course, with Brennan Armstrong slinging the ball around last year. But I think the new offensive coordinator is going to opt to want to throw the ball a lot more. Virginia liked to throw the ball a lot last year. And I think maybe Garrett Strader airing it out a little bit more, maybe they'll be better for this team. But we shall see. Of course, there's a big ceiling capped on this offense, of course, but the defense, like you said, should be maybe a little bit better. They return 8 starters. They did land some guys in the portal. And then the schedule, UConn, Wagner, that should be 2 wins there. The thing is, like you said, the rest of the schedule, it's tough. You're sitting here with a win total at 4. We got 2 wins that we think are likely with UConn and Wagner. And then a lot of these games that maybe you think they could win, maybe your toss-ups at Boston College, at Wake, at Pitt, those are all road games. Virginia at home potentially could be a win. They have Purdue in the non-con. I'm pretty high on this Purdue team. I think Purdue should be able to beat them, but they got them at home earlier in the season. When it's all said and done, it's just hard for me to find another 2 wins, another 3 wins for this over here. And originally, when I first did my research into this team, I was thinking, I think I'm going to like Syracuse. I like the Syracuse team in general. I'm probably going to pick over. But then when you look at the schedule, it's a tough division, man. This Atlantic division is tough. And I think if Syracuse was over in the Coastal, I think they'd be the 5th, maybe even 4th best team. But unfortunately, they're stuck in the Atlantic this year. They're the worst team in this division. And yeah, I think 4 wins is probably 3 or 4 wins, probably more likely than 5 or 6. So I'm going to have to go under, even though this pains me. And I truthfully wouldn't be surprised if Syracuse is a team that kind of shocks people a little bit. Maybe they get to a bowl game. Maybe they upset a good team or 2 in this division, but I'm going to have to lean under for this, but not very confident in it. And in our next video, we will be covering the ACC Coastal, the crazy Coastal division that seems to have a different winner every single year. It is truly parity in college football, always rests in the ACC Coastal. We see you guys for that. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and of course, leave a comment. What do you think about these teams? If you're a fan of one of these teams that we just covered today, let us know what you think and your thoughts on your team and their outlook for this year. And with that being said, this is Xan Shoob signing out.